and welcome back to another episode of Bossing English with Mr. F. Today we'll be looking at Inspector Calls, primarily the setting. We'll make some references to Aristotle, and I'll be getting you to think about why that setting is so useful for you in answering any questions on Inspector Calls, bearing in mind that you could get one on the setting. It's never come up, but I've seen it in an example question before. And how to use AO3 based on J.B. Priestley's biography, linking that specifically to the setting. So let's get started. Okay, so this is the book edition, which some of you may be using, the Heinemann book. And on the left, you can see we have a list of the characters. Note the absence of Eva Smith/Daisy Renton, who you could think of more as an absent presence, a void, deliberately off stage to show the lack of presence, the lack of physical reality she has for the Burlings, maybe. Okay, so let's get started. All three acts, which are continuous, take place in the dining room of the Burlings' house in Brumley, an industrial city in the North Midlands. It is an evening in spring 1912. Okay, so let's just have a look at some of the questions. Why the continuity of time, place, and action? All three acts, which are continuous, take place in the dining room of the Burlings' house in Brumley. Well, this links to a philosopher, ancient Greek, called Aristotle, who wrote a book called Poetics, in which he argued that great plays needed to have the three unities: unity of time, unity of place, unity of action. You can read a little bit more about this here on this website. I'll put this link in the description so you can read a bit more. They require a play to have a single action represented as occurring in a single place and within the course of a day. The principles were called unity of action, unity of place, unity of time. So by doing this, Priestley is kind of making reference to, or choosing, a generic convention of having these three unities, as Aristotle suggested were necessary for a great play in his book, The Poetics. Maybe that also adds to the action, adds a layer of reality, doesn't it? If things are happening in real time, and we feel like we as an audience are watching this unfold in real time, sequentially, as opposed to being kind of divided up back and forth. Note that this is very different to the film version that you will be probably watching on the BBC. It's the latest televised version or adaptation of an Inspector Calls, because there we have the ability to use flashbacks, which is not the case when it's a stage adaptation of the play. Other things to think about. It is an evening in spring 1912. Now, this is something that doesn't really get mentioned. Why is it set on a spring evening? Well, when we think of spring, we might think of rebirth. After the winter, regeneration, being reborn, renaissance. Remember, this play was written and published and performed just after the Second World War, 1945-1946. The first production, as you can see here, first produced in London, October 1946. A post-World War II audience would themselves be experiencing this idea of rebirth or regeneration. Similarly, we know that after the war, there was a landslide victory for the Labour Party. We know that J.B. Priestley was a socialist, an ardent socialist, and so he would, maybe be hoping for a political regeneration or rebirth of the country. And so maybe that kind of spring setting suggests that out of this tragedy of the play, something more meaningful and in terms of social equality and responsibility and understanding can be enacted in the body politic of the United Kingdom after the war, with a new government, socialist government in place. Okay, let's have a look at the next question. How can we link the setting to the playwright J.B. Priestley? Well, let's have a look at these initial stage directions. So useful. You'll be familiar and should be, if you get a character question, always kind of coming back to the Burling, the descriptions that you have here at the bottom. We can see Burling, Sheila, etc. So if you get a character question, I'm sure you'll be familiar with using short quotes from those, like the word portentous, heavy looking, pretty girl, a rather cold woman for Sybil. Okay, but sometimes what we don't use is the setting for the house, and I think that's quite interesting because there are direct links to J.B. Priestley's own life, and we could kind of shoe in some AO3 there, which could lead to, there were 6 marks for AO3. Always useful to try and find links to the author, the playwright's life where possible. The dining room of a fairly large suburban house belonging to a prosperous manufacturer. It has good, solid furniture of the period. The general effect is substantial and heavily comfortable, but not cosy and homelike. Well, if we go to the Wikipedia page on J.B. Priestley, what we find is he was born and grew up in Manningham, which he described as an extremely respectable suburb of Bradford. So maybe his house was similar to this. Maybe he knew other houses of friends that were similar to this, which were large, had good solid furniture, but maybe where some of these new wealthy industrialists were putting on a show. It was all about appearance rather than the reality, and that these appearances masked a rather darker reality. So where the furniture is good and solid, some nice adjectives there, is substantial, and we have this oxymoronic phrase, heavily comfortable, it's not cozy or home-like. I'll just see if I can get some things up here. No, I can't. I don't know where they've gone, those things. Never mind. All right, so I think we can take short quotes to talk about this jarring description where the furniture is an ostentatious display of wealth, but actually is not cozy and home-like. So there's something wrong with this family. There's something jarring, and it's all materialism and ostentatious display rather than a kind of warm, loving family at heart. So that's the furniture description. I've kind of moved on to that second question. The lighting at the end of this large paragraph. The lighting should be pink and intimate until the inspector arrives, and then it should be brighter and harder. Now, the classic way to use this would be to look at that little phrase, pink and intimate, and think of rose-tinted glasses, the way that the Burlings see the world through their privileged, wealthy position. And when the inspector arrives, and the inspector really is really representing Priestley's viewpoint, a stand-in for Priestley, we might say, or his political beliefs of socialism and social equality. He brings with him this interrogation lamp and shines a light on the hypocrisies and harsh realities of this family who have this privileged position but are not using it to do social good for those less fortunate than themselves. So brighter and harder, those adjectives there, comparative adjectives, you could explore the way that he's trying to engineer change and wake them up, kind of shine a light on who they are and reveal to themselves why they need to change. Other things that we get in the description that could link to that extremely respectable, sorry, it's this one, isn't it? Middle-class upbringing that Priestley himself had, of the champagne glasses, decanter of port, cigar box. He may, again, have been exposed to things like that in the suburb that he was growing up in himself, or been, acquainted with friends at his grammar school who were the product of, that kind of new money, industrial wealth, and like the Burlings, were not necessarily generous in sharing that wealth with the less fortunate. So something to think about there. Finally, I'd like to just draw a parallel between Eva Smith and, again, Priestley's biography. His mother, Emma, was a mill girl. She died very young, 31, and it's possible when we think of the industrial work that the Burlings did in the BBC adaptation, it's a factory, isn't it? It's a milling factory, and the north and northwest and Bradford were known for the mill trade and the cotton trade and wool. And Priestley himself, even much later, once kind of almost moving into the post-industrial age, was working for a wool firm when he left school. So that was still going on when he was a school leaver. So I just think, again, maybe he had his mother in mind, or he knew people like Eva Smith from the background and the place that he grew up in Bradford. So that's worth bearing in mind when we think about where these characters are and the reality that Priestley knew and how he's putting them in there. Okay, what I'll do is I will link this, because I would thoroughly recommend reading that whole page, especially the stuff about the war, the reference to fire and blood and anguish that we get in the final monologue, and the apocalyptic imagery. It can easily be linked to the war experience that Priestley himself had in the First World War, and why he's reminding the audience it just after the Second World War. Furthermore, I'll put that link in about the three unities. You can read a bit more about Aristotle and the classical tradition of drama. And this is a brilliant page. The British Library is always useful for all the set texts that you're studying: Macbeth, An Inspector Calls, A Christmas Carol, Jekyll and Hyde, whatever it might be. So this one finds links between Priestley's biography and An Inspector Calls, but also other works that he was writing on the way up, leading up to An Inspector Calls. So, you know, he was very socialist principles developed early on in his life, and we see that emerging much earlier than in Spectacles. That's not his only socialist play, so it's worth thinking about where else he's engaged with socialist ideas in his oeuvre, in his collected works, and how maybe that's led up to An Inspector Calls, and why that, you know, there's a lot to get out of it, out of that article. I'm not going to go into all of that, but you certainly should, if you want to maximize your AO3 and to write maybe a more conceptualized answer, pushing for those 8s and 9s at GCSE. Right, there we are. I hope that's been useful. If it has, smash that like button, do something appropriate to the subscribe button, leave a comment if you've got any questions. It'd be nice to hear from you, and I shall see you very soon. Bye for now.